In 1882, the most famous landscape architect in the United States agreed to design a park on a swampy island in the Detroit River. He waived his standard consulting fee. He chartered his own boat to prove the ferry dock would work. He published the plans at his own expense. And when he submitted a $70 invoice for travel, the Detroit Common Council refused to pay it. Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who built Central Park, quit the project. And when someone later asked him about Belle Isle, he said 5 words: "I know nothing of this place." It is one of the most extraordinary sentences in the history of American parks, because the place he was denying was one of the most extraordinary pieces of public land in the country. Belle Isle sits in the Detroit River between the United States and Canada, 982 acres of island, bigger than Central Park, with buildings designed by Albert Kahn, Cass Gilbert, and Emil Lorch, a fountain that cost $500,000 in 1925, an aquarium that was the 3rd largest in the world when it opened, a conservatory that is the oldest continuously operating greenhouse in the nation, a boat club that has trained 19 Olympians, and, at its peak, a casino that was called the finest in America. All of it paid for with public money, private fortunes, and, in one remarkable case, 60,000 individual donations of pennies and nickels during the Great Depression. And all of it, by the early 2000s, falling apart. Belle Isle is the largest city-owned island park in the United States. For decades, it was also the most neglected. The aquarium closed, the zoo closed, the boat club left. Thieves stripped the copper from the fountain. The bathrooms didn't work. The Carillon Tower that 60,000 Detroiters had paid for with their pocket change went silent. None of this happened because of a hurricane or a bankruptcy filing or a single catastrophic event. It happened the way most beautiful things are lost, slowly, one deferred repair at a time, while everyone assumed someone else was going to take care of it. But to understand how Belle Isle arrived at that point, you need to go back to when it was still called Hog Island, and nobody thought it was beautiful at all. When the French founded Detroit in 1701, the island in the river was useful for exactly one thing: keeping livestock safe from predators on the mainland. The French settlers let their pigs and cattle roam the swampy ground, and so they called it Île aux Cochons, Hog Island. The native peoples who had used the waterway for centuries knew it as Manabazi, which meant the swan. It is difficult to imagine 2 names that capture the gap between vision and reality more completely. During the Revolutionary War, the British turned the island into something uglier. Between roughly 1780 and 1782, Hog Island held hundreds of American prisoners of war and their families, captured at the battles of Ruddle's Fort and Martin's Station in Kentucky. Among them was Isaac Ruddle, the founder of Ruddle's Fort, who would spend years as a captive. The island that would one day become Detroit's most beloved public space began its American life as a prison camp. After the War of 1812, a general named Alexander Macomb, Jr. acquired the island as his private estate. Macomb would go on to become the commanding general of the United States Army, the highest-ranking military officer in the country. And yet his island sat there, privately held, for decades. It passed through the Macomb family and eventually to the Campeau family, one of the old French dynasties of Detroit. The renaming happened on the 4th of July, 1845. Members of the Detroit Boat Club, the oldest rowing club in America, founded in 1839 by a man named E.A. Brush and 6 other prominent Detroiters, rowed out to the island for a picnic. They decided the place deserved something better than Hog Island. They renamed it Belle Isle in honor of Isabel Cass, daughter of Governor Lewis Cass. The name played on the French phrase Belle Isle, beautiful island, a nod to the French heritage and a statement of ambition. It was a name the island would spend the next century and a half trying to live up to. The city didn't actually buy it until September 23, 1879, but the argument about doing so had been raging for nearly a decade. By 1870, Detroit had the desire and the money to build a major public park, but the city council couldn't agree on a location. Quarrels over the matter consumed the newspapers for years in what reporters called the park question. The hostility peaked when the city council tried to purchase land in Hamtramck. Citizens held anti-park meetings and protests, and when the council threatened to push through the purchase anyway, residents took the issue to the Michigan Supreme Court, arguing it was unlawful to spend public money against the will of the people. The idea to put the park on Belle Isle was first proposed by L. Barber, a lawyer and University of Michigan regent. It was the answer that should have been obvious from the beginning, an island that already belonged to nobody in particular, floating in the river like a gift waiting to be opened. The city purchased the island from the Campaw family heirs for $200,000. The total appropriation for the park project was roughly $700,000, about $23 million in today's money. The legislation that authorized the purchase also gave Detroit the right to build Grand Boulevard, the ring road that would separate urban Detroit from the farms beyond. In other words, the deal that gave the city its island park also gave it the bones of its street grid. Belle Isle and the shape of the modern city were conceived in the same breath. That brings us back to Olmstead. In 1882, Detroit hired the great man to transform Belle Isle from a mosquito-ridden swamp into a public park on the scale of his masterpiece in Manhattan. Olmstead saw the challenge immediately. The island was low-lying, marshy, and, as he put it, offered conditions that could not be more favorable to the breeding and nursing of mosquitoes. His solution was elegant. He proposed a system of underground pipes draining into canals, which would double as waterways for pleasure boating. He wanted to concentrate all the public buildings, the ferry dock, the pavilion, on the western tip, leaving the vast majority of the island in its natural wooded state. The park would be defined not by what was built on it, but by what was left alone. Detroit wanted something different. The Common Council wanted buildings. They wanted attractions, gathering halls, bathhouses, sporting fields. They looked at Olmsted's plan, a plea for restraint on an island where restraint was the whole point, and rejected most of it. They refused to build his ferry dock on the western end. When Olmsted chartered a boat himself and landed it there to prove the dock was feasible, they were unimpressed. When he published his plan at his own expense, hoping to rally public opinion, they shrugged. And when he submitted his invoice, $70.25, they denied it. Olmsted resigned and never came back. The elements of his design that survived, Central Avenue, the canal system, the preserved woodlands, became the island's most enduring features. Everything he warned about, the cluttering of the island with institutions, the loss of natural landscape to development, happened within a generation. It is tempting to say that Detroit made a mistake in rejecting Olmsted, but the truth is more complicated. What the city built over the next 40 years was, in its own way, magnificent. It just wasn't what Olmsted had in mind. And in the end, it was too much for the city to maintain. The golden age of Belle Isle construction lasted roughly from 1887 to 1925, and it left the island with a collection of public buildings that would be the envy of any city in America. The first casino, not a gambling house but a public gathering hall in the old European sense, was a 3-story wooden structure built in 1887 with wraparound verandas that looked out over the Detroit River. It was so popular that within 20 years the city had outgrown it. The Detroit Free Press gave the old building an affectionate eulogy. Through the heat and cold, in season and out of season, the casino has done service. Were those old walls to speak, they could tell strange tales. In May 1908, a new casino, designed by the architectural firm Van Leyen and Schilling, opened just to the south. A Beaux-Arts building with terrazzo floors, marble staircases, and wrought iron balconies. It cost $135,000 and was immediately declared the most complete and finest casino in the United States. That same year, 1904, had already seen the opening of 2 Albert Kahn buildings that remain standing and functioning today. The Belle Isle Aquarium, designed by Kahn with George D. Mason, opened on August 18, 1904, and was, at the time, the third largest aquarium in the world. The building covered 10,000 square feet and centered on a single grand gallery with an arched ceiling tiled entirely in green glass, a deliberate choice meant to make visitors feel as if they were underwater. More than 120 years later, the effect still works. Adjacent to the aquarium, Kahn and Mason built the Anna Scripps Whitcomb Conservatory, a greenhouse with a central palm house dome rising 85 feet, surrounded by a cactus house, a fernery, a tropical house, and a show house for seasonal displays. It opened the same day as the aquarium and is today the oldest continually operating conservatory in the United States. Kahn also designed the Livingstone Memorial Lighthouse on the eastern tip of the island, the only marble lighthouse in the country, named for William Livingston, who, as president of the Lakes Carriers Association, had pushed for navigational safety improvements on the Great Lakes. It is a building almost too fine for its purpose, built of materials meant for courthouses and banks, standing at the edge of an island park where most visitors never venture. In 1980, vandals damaged it badly enough to require a security fence around its perimeter. That fence is still there. The island itself was not even the same size it is today. In 1913, thousands of yards of dirt from the excavation of the new Statler Hotel downtown were barged out to Belle Isle and dumped at the island's foot, building out new ground for the yacht club. The biggest expansion came between 1921 and 1923, when 24.5 acres were added to the southern tip to create the site for the Scott Fountain, with another 29.5 acres added elsewhere. During the construction boom of the 1920s, developers across Detroit were happy to pay someone to haul away their excavation fill, and Belle Isle was happy to take it. The island grew like a coral reef, one construction project at a time. Meanwhile, the Detroit Boat Club was engaged in a long and fiery relationship with the island. The club had moved from the mainland to Belle Isle in 1889, and its first clubhouse on the island burned down in 1893. The second burned in 1901. For the third attempt, in 1902, they built the thing out of brick and concrete, one of the earliest fully concrete buildings in the United States, with pilings driven into bedrock beneath the Detroit River. They were not going to burn this one down. The Mediterranean-style clubhouse became a Detroit landmark, and the rowing program that operated out of it would eventually produce more than 500 national champions and 19 Olympians. The old Belle Isle Bridge deserves its own story. The original iron bridge with wooden decking, built in 1889, had a swing section that opened at midnight to allow ships through the channel. Once it opened, no one on the island could get back to the mainland until morning. To be stranded on Belle Isle after midnight was, in the language of Detroit society, tantamount to disgrace and social ostracism. Every dance at the Boat Club and the Detroit Yacht Club ended promptly at 11:30. The bridge burned accidentally in April 1915, and for 8 years the island could only be reached by ferry and a temporary wooden span. In 1913, 2 years before the fire, William Edmund Scripps of the publishing family had flown a Curtiss flying boat underneath the bridge, a stunt that captured more attention than perhaps it deserved, but which captures the kind of city Detroit was in those years: rich, confident, doing things for the sheer joy of proving they could be done. The replacement bridge opened November 1st, 1923. Designed by Emil Lorch, an architect of the University of Michigan who did relatively few buildings but did this one magnificently, it stretched 2,193 feet across the river on 19 concrete arches, one of the first 3 cantilevered arch bridges in the United States. It cost $2.635 million. The newspapers called it the realization of a civic improvement upon which Detroit's dreams have been centered nearly a quarter of a century. Streetcar tracks were built into the east side, but a streetcar line was never implemented. The tracks were eventually paved over in the 1950s. The dances, however, continued to end at 11:30, long after anyone remembered why. The bridge was originally named the George Washington Bridge. In 1942, it was renamed the Douglas MacArthur Bridge after the general. Most Detroiters have always just called it the Belle Isle Bridge. There is a story about the Belle Isle Bridge that changed the automobile industry, and it is almost certainly true in its essence, even if some of the details have been muddled over a century of retelling. In 1908, the exact date and circumstances are debated by historians, with some accounts saying it happened on the bridge, others on the island's roads. A man named Byron Carter stopped to help a stranded motorist. Carter was not an ordinary passerby. He was 44 years old, a mechanical genius, the founder of the Carter Car Company, an early automobile manufacturer. The stranded car was a Cadillac. Carter offered to crank-start the engine, the standard procedure in the days before electric starters, and a notoriously dangerous one. The engine kicked back. The iron crank smashed into Carter's jaw, breaking it. Complications from the injury led to pneumonia, and on April 6, 1908, Byron Carter died at his home in Detroit. Carter was a friend of Henry Leland, the founder and president of Cadillac. Leland was devastated, and doubly so because it was one of his own company's cars that had killed his friend. According to later accounts, Leland swore that the Cadillac car would kill no more men. He brought the problem to Charles Kettering, a young engineer at the newly formed Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, Delco. Kettering had experience with high-torque electric motors from his earlier work on cash registers. By February 1911, he had produced a working electric self-starter. Leland ordered 12,000 of them. The 1912 Cadillac became the first car to offer an electric starter as standard equipment. Within 2 years, hand cranking was obsolete. Within a decade, it was forgotten. A man stopped to help a stranger on the Belle Isle Bridge, and his death changed every car built since. The island has always had a talent for being the place where the story turns. 2 years after the bridge opened, the most contentious gift in Detroit history arrived at the southern tip of the island. James Scott was dead, and he wanted everyone to know it. Scott had been, by any reasonable measure, Detroit's most disliked citizen. The son of a successful real estate investor, he inherited a fortune and spent his days not working, gambling, telling off-color stories, and filing lawsuits against anyone who annoyed him. The historian W. Hawkins Ferry called him a vindictive, scurrilous misanthrope. He once built a mansion he never intended to live in, gorgeous from the front, nothing but a high brick wall in the back, solely to block his neighbor's light and destroy the value of the adjacent lot. It was known as Scott's Folly. He hung a giant gilded pig on a building near some grocers who had offended him. He was a perpetual bachelor who, as the polite accounts put it, frequently entertained women of less moral fiber. When Scott died in 1910, he left his entire estate, approximately $600,000, to the city of Detroit with a single condition. The money must be used to build a fountain on Belle Isle, and the fountain must include a life-sized bronze statue of James Scott himself. The city nearly refused. Bishop Charles D. Williams and other community leaders argued that Detroit should not honor such a scoundrel with a public monument. The debate made national news, appearing in the New York Times, but money won out. Mayor Philip Breitmeyer put it simply, "I don't believe the city has a right to insult any of her citizens by refusing a gift for such a good cause." A nationwide competition was held, and the winning architect was Cass Gilbert, the man who had designed the United States Supreme Court building and the Detroit Public Library. The James Scott Memorial Fountain was unveiled on May 31, 1925, 15 years after Scott's death. It cost $500,000 to build. The lower bowl measured 510 feet across. The central spray could reach 125 feet into the air. It had 109 water outlets in the shapes of dolphins, turtles, lions, and human figures, all carved from Vermont white marble. And there behind the fountain, almost hidden from public view, sat the bronze statue of James Scott, positioned, legend has it, so that the spray would hit him in the face. The inscription on the back of his chair reads, "For the enjoyment of the people and for the adornment of his native city." It was either a generous act from a misunderstood man or the final practical joke of a lifelong prankster. It was probably both. The gifts kept coming. In the mid-1930s, at the bottom of the Great Depression, a newspaper columnist named Nancy Brown, the pen name of Annie Louise Leslie, whose real identity was a closely guarded secret at the Detroit News, suggested that her readers gather on Belle Isle for a religious sunrise service. 30,000 people showed up the first year. The following year, an estimated 50,000. Brown's readers proposed building a peace carillon on the island, and in 1936 the campaign began. More than 60,000 people contributed. The plan was to pay for it entirely with donations at no expense to the city. The 85-foot neo-Gothic tower cost nearly $59,000. Nancy Brown herself broke ground on October 30th, 1939. The cornerstone was laid on December 13th. The original site in a grove of willows was abandoned because Brown refused to let anyone cut down the trees. The tower was dedicated at the 7th annual sunrise service on June 16, 1940, before a crowd of 50,000. The first public concert was played on July 4, 1940. The very last penny needed to cover the construction cost was donated on December 7, 1941, the day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. A peace tower, fully paid for on the first day of the war. Nancy Brown retired in February 1942 and died on October 7, 1948. On the day of her funeral, a carillonneur played her favorite hymns from the tower her readers had built. By 1943, Detroit was calling itself the Arsenal of Democracy. Its automobile factories had been retooled for war production, turning out tanks, bombers, and jeeps at a scale no city on earth could match. Nearly 400,000 migrants, both black and white, most from the South, had poured into the city between 1941 and 1943, competing for jobs, housing, and space in a city that was already bursting. Detroit's 200,000 black residents were packed into 60 square blocks on the Near East Side, in the neighborhoods called Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, subdivided into apartments that often held multiple families. White neighborhoods enforced their borders with threats, arson, and in one case, at the Sojourner Truth Housing Project in 1942, a mob of more than 1,000 armed picketers. Belle Isle was drawing enormous summer crowds, over 100,000 visitors on a hot weekend. The island was one of the few public spaces in Detroit that was functionally integrated. White and black Detroiters swam at the same beach, picnicked in the same groves, and crossed the same bridge. In a city where segregation was enforced through housing covenants, workplace discrimination, and outright violence, Belle Isle was the place where the lines blurred. On the evening of June 20th, 1943, that blurring became a flashpoint. Small fights broke out between groups of white and black teenagers on the island. By nightfall, the violence had spread to the bridge, where the crush of more than 100,000 people trying to leave the island created a bottleneck. White sailors from a nearby naval armory waded into the fighting. Then the rumors started. At the Forest Social Club on Hastings Street in the heart of Paradise Valley, Detroit's black neighborhood, a man named Leo Tipton told the crowd that white men had thrown a black woman and her baby off the Belle Isle Bridge. In white neighborhoods, a mirror image rumor spread, that black men had raped and murdered a white woman on the bridge. Neither rumor was true. No woman was thrown, no baby drowned, no one was murdered on the bridge that night. But 34 people were killed in the riots that followed over the next 36 hours. 25 of them were black. 17 of the 25 were killed by police. Federal troops were brought in to restore order. It was, at that point, one of the worst episodes of racial violence in American history. and it started on the island that was supposed to be the one place in Detroit where everyone was welcome. The bridge where it happened is still the only way on and off the island. The war brought one more strange chapter. In 1945, after the successful invasion of Iwo Jima, the U.S. military used Belle Isle for a public reenactment of a Pacific island assault. The Navy and Marine Corps staged a mock invasion while Detroiters watched from the banks. The island was temporarily renamed Bella Jima. It was a spectacle, patriotic, theatrical, and deeply odd. An island that had been a POW camp during the Revolution, a race riot flashpoint 2 years earlier, was now a stage set for war games. For a generation after the war, Belle Isle remained the city's backyard. Families held reunions in the picnic groves. The conservatory drew more than 1 million visitors a year in the 1920s, and it continued to pull crowds into the 1950s. In 1953, Anna Scripps Whitcomb, daughter of Detroit News founder James E. Scripps, died and bequeathed 600 rare orchids to the conservatory, many of which had been rescued from Britain during the Blitz. The conservatory was renamed in her honor in 1955, and Detroit suddenly owned one of the largest municipally held orchid collections in the country. The zoo, which had started small in the 1890s with a few bears and deer, was expanded repeatedly through the 20th century. A $4.5 million overhaul in 1976 created a unique feature, a quarter-mile network of elevated wooden walkways 10 to 12 feet in the air, winding through trees and across ponds, letting visitors view animals from above. Peak attendance hit 240,000 in 1980. That same year, a 9-month-old bear escaped and swam half a mile across the Detroit River to Windsor, Canada, setting off a Free the Bear campaign that succeeded. But even at its peak, Belle Isle's infrastructure was aging. The Nancy Brown Peace Carillon stopped playing in 1970, damaged by pigeons and vandalism, its stained glass windows smashed. That year, while Detroit faced a $22.5 million budget deficit, the general superintendent of the city's Department of Parks and Recreation said what would become the epitaph for a generation of Belle Isle maintenance: "We haven't got the money to repair it." It was a sentence that could have been applied to nearly everything on the island for the next 4 decades. The decline was not dramatic. It was the kind of ruin that comes from not fixing a roof, then not fixing the ceiling under it, then not fixing the floor below that. Belle Isle's deterioration tracked Detroit's almost exactly. The city that had peaked at 1.85 million people in 1950 lost population every decade that followed, to the suburbs, to the Sun Belt, to deindustrialization, to white flight, to every force that hollowed out the industrial Midwest. By 2010, Detroit was down to 713,000 people. The tax base shrank with every moving truck. Belle Isle got what was left over after police, fire, and essential services, which increasingly meant it got nothing. Water pipes froze and were not repaired. Roofs leaked into buildings that had been designed by some of the best architects in America. The zoo was rebranded Safari Land in the late 1980s, and attendance dropped steadily under competition from the larger Detroit Zoo in Royal Oak. In August 2001, 88% of Detroit voters backed a ballot measure to keep the Belle Isle Zoo open. In April 2002, Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick closed it anyway. In 2004, voters approved a bond issue specifically to reopen the zoo. The funds were redirected to build a nature center instead. The zoo buildings sat abandoned for more than 20 years, collecting graffiti and slowly disappearing under vines. The aquarium, the oldest continually operating public aquarium in North America, closed on April 3, 2005, done in by the same budget constraints that had already shuttered the zoo. The orchids that Anna Scripps Whitcomb had bequeathed, the ones saved from the London bombings, mostly died from neglect. The Livingston Memorial Lighthouse, Albert Kahn's marble folly on the eastern tip, stood behind its vandal-proof fence. The Scott Fountain, that $500,000 monument to a scoundrel designed by the architect of the Supreme Court, stopped running for years at a stretch. When IndyCar racing came to Belle Isle in 2007, the race organizers recognized what an iconic backdrop the fountain would make and commissioned an engineer to get it working again. Each year, the Grand Prix would run the fountain, and each year the city would shut it off again afterward. After a restoration around 2005, thieves stole the copper components, rendering the fountain inoperable once more. The Detroit Boat Club, the oldest rowing club in America, with its 1902 fireproof clubhouse built on pilings driven into the bedrock of the Detroit River, saw its rent jump from $1 to $100,000 in 1992. Membership dropped. Utility payments fell behind. In 1996, the social club left Belle Isle entirely. The building that had survived 3 fires began to deteriorate from something worse: emptiness. By the 2020s, repair estimates ran to $50 million, and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources openly discussed demolition. Under the city's ordinance, Belle Isle was supposed to close at 10 each night. In reality, the park had activity around the clock, and much of it was not the kind Olmstead had envisioned. A Michigan Department of Transportation study found that the average speed of a car on Belle Isle's perimeter road was 45 miles per hour, 20 over the posted limit of 25. The park that had been designed for strolling, picnicking, and canoeing was being used as a drag strip. The end came on July 18, 2013, when the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, with debt estimated at up to $20 billion. The city that had bought Belle Isle for $200,000 in 1879 could no longer afford to mow the grass on it. The city was spending roughly $950,000 a year on Belle Isle operations, not including policing, and couldn't sustain even that. In January 2013, the Detroit City Council voted unanimously to reject a proposal to lease Belle Isle to the state of Michigan. They saw it as a loss of sovereignty, the city handing over its most iconic asset to outside control. But in November 2013, Kevin Orr, the emergency manager appointed by Governor Rick Snyder, whose authority superseded the elected council, pushed the 30-year lease through. The decision was, depending on who was telling the story, either the rescue of a dying park or the seizure of a beloved city asset by a state government that had no democratic mandate from the people of Detroit. On February 10, 2014, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources assumed management. Belle Isle, the city park, became Belle Isle State Park. Ron Olson, the chief of the DNR's Parks and Recreation Division, described what they found. None of the bathrooms were open at all. Everything was closed. There was a lot of vandalism. There was water leaking from water pipes that had frozen but weren't repaired. A lot of roofs that were bad, leaking into buildings. The state started with the basics: trash pickup, functioning bathrooms, security. The DNR began enforcing park closure hours. A security guard was posted at the bridge entrance. Conservation officers and Michigan State Police provided a visible law enforcement presence. The city's cash-strapped police department was freed up for neighborhood policing. The average car speed on the perimeter road came down. The investment over the first decade was substantial. By 2024, the state and its partners had spent more than $115 million in capital improvements. The Scott Fountain was restored and ran daily through the summer, complete with a light show at dusk. The aquarium, which had been dark for 7 years, was reopened on August 18, 2012, the same date it had originally opened in 1904, by the Belle Isle Conservancy, a non-profit formed from the merger of 4 smaller groups. The conservatory continued operating, its orchids depleted, but its palms and cacti intact. The Nancy Brown Peace Carillon, fitted with new chimes in 2003, was automated and plays daily. The casino, the Beaux-Arts building that had hosted weddings and receptions for over a century, closed in 2023 for a comprehensive restoration. It reopened on March 13, 2026, 313 Day, named for Detroit's area code, after a $7.3 million investment. Belle Isle now draws more than 5 million visitors a year. It is the second most visited state park in the United States, behind only Niagara Falls. And yet the story is not simply one of decline and rescue. It never is with a place this layered. The state still estimates it needs $200 million to address the full backlog of repairs and renovations. The Boat Club building may or may not survive. The Scott Fountain closed again in 2025 for a $6 million overhaul of its century-old plumbing and foundations, and is not expected to reopen until 2027. The zoo site sat abandoned for over 20 years before demolition finally began, clearing space for the trails and canal access that the public overwhelmingly said they wanted. Some Detroiters still view the state lease as a theft, the emergency manager's override of the city council's unanimous vote, a wound that has not fully healed. The Udolph Garden, designed by the Dutch master Piet Udolph and opened in 2021, surrounding the Nancy Brown Tower with the kind of carefully wild plantings that Olmstead might have recognized, is one of the most beautiful public gardens in the country. It replaced the weeds and overgrown beds that had choked the Carillon's moat for decades. The bridge, the MacArthur Bridge, the Belle Isle Bridge, the bridge where Byron Carter died and the 1943 riot exploded, and 100,000 people tried to get home on a June evening, is still the only way on or off the island. There was never a second crossing built. There was never a tunnel. There were never streetcars, despite the tracks laid into the concrete in 1923. For nearly 150 years, Detroit's relationship with its island has been mediated by a single bridge. Everything beautiful and everything terrible that has happened on Belle Isle has crossed that bridge, in one direction or the other. Frederick Law Olmsted wanted to leave the island alone, to let the trees and the water and the sky do the work. Detroit wanted to build on it, fill it with institutions, cover it with attractions. Both impulses were sincere. Both left their marks. The island took everything that was given to it. Kahn's green glass ceiling, Scott's vindictive fountain, Nancy Brown's pennies, the 1943 rumors, the orchids from the London Blitz, the bear that swam to Canada. And it held them all in its own patient, swampy, 982-acre way, whether anyone was paying attention or not. The Carillon plays on the half hour. If you are standing close enough, you can hear it over the geese.